Hello.
Hello.
Sorry, I was having some technical difficulties. Hey, Leah. Hey, Josh. Hi, Melissa. Hey, Rebecca.
A bunch of us were just in the meeting and got kicked out of it. And so there's like 3, 4, 5 of us trying to figure out how to get back in. So I just texted a few of them to tell them how I managed to get back into the meeting. So there's a bunch still joining.
Okay, thanks. Yes, there's some funky things going on with the connections on campus. I think you all experienced something, and it was not just with our class, but it was with all of the online classes. Hey, Josh.
Hey.
There was the whole system went down over the weekend. So I know that caused a lot of frustrations, and I was emailing Victor and Adam, but I think everything has been fixed. The video links, so you should all be able to get on. Hey, Jessica. Hey, William. Hi,
Hey.
Erica.
Hi.
You all look a little tired.
Definitely.
Definitely. I'll be at Big Island tomorrow for those of you who are there. Sorry I was not there today, but our car broke down in Pennsylvania. Yeah, that was fun. But I'm back in Virginia. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Any particular questions? I got a few questions via email from some students who could not join tonight. Oops. My husband calling me, I don't know why. So, question. None? I'm getting some feedback for some reason. All right, so one of the things I wanted to talk tonight was the difference between accommodations and modifications. And I know there are a few people who know the difference. Would anyone like to chime in?
I can.
Okay, Erica?
So an accommodation is something that just helps the student in the classroom or helps to take a test, but they still have the same curriculum, whereas an accommodation or a modification changes their curriculum.
Yes. So who can give us some examples of typical accommodations?
I know a big one is like extended time on tests.
Yep.
That's a big one.
That's a common accommodation.
Mm-hmm.
Small group testing.
Mm-hmm.
Small group testing. So let's talk first about extended time. What are the typical parameters for extended time? On assignments or on tests?
There has to be a given extended amount of time. It can't just be an unlimited. So maybe like twice the amount of time or 1.5 times the amount of time.
Correct. So it's 50% of the time or time and a half or double time. So then that must be written into the IEP.
Yes.
So if you're on an IEP team, you want to make sure that that is very clear as an accommodation. And so as Erica pointed out, you're not changing the curriculum. You're not changing the expectations or what the student needs to learn. You're providing an accommodation to make the playing field even. So what do we mean? Because you'll hear that phrase a lot. What do we mean by making, do you all hear that feedback?
Just a little bit, but yeah, I can still hear you.
Sorry. What do we mean by making the playing field even?
The same opportunity to all students. Because someone has a disability, we don't want to give them, if you give them the same, basically they have a lesser chance because they don't have the same capability as other students.
Okay. So be careful about the term as they don't have the same capability, because sometimes that perpetuates lower expectations, right? And I think one of the last videos, and I should have moved it a little bit earlier, one of the last videos on the section about dyslexia, you might want to watch that earlier than later because it's a pretty powerful video and it's under the section on dyslexia, and I think that's kind of one of the later videos that you watch. Because that would be a good one to discuss. And I'll have to, I wonder if I can find it on my phone. Maybe if somebody can find it on your, in the list on Moodle under dyslexia. But oftentimes what happens is when teachers hear that a child has an IEP, what do people automatically jump to?
A deficit model?
A deficit model. Okay. What can this child not do? Right? Rather than focusing on the student's strength. And if we're talking about most of the accommodations and the modifications, either under IDEA or under the 504, right? And those are different. What's the difference between IDEA and 504? A 504 plan.
IDEA is federally funded. I know that's one difference, right?
IDEA is federally funded. There are funds available under IDEA. IDEA covers whom?
Individuals with disabilities.
Yeah, more specifically, if I had a disability, am I covered under IDEA?
If it affects you academically.
I see your head shaking.
Wouldn't it just be students with disabilities?
More specifically, what do you mean? Define students.
Students in public school?
More specifically, IDEA covers children ages 3
to 21?
21, correct. So the states have to cover children under the age of 3. So in the state of Virginia, we have something called Project Daniel. And that covers children birth through up to 3 years old. And then once a child is 3 years old, then they will fall under the public school system. Okay? And if I am 18 years old and I'm supposed to graduate, but I have not met all graduation requirements, what happens?
Can't you just stay in school for a couple more years?
You have to, yes. If the student wants to remain in the public school system has to let them, because IDEA covers people up until they're 21 years of age. So the public school would then have to provide what?
You mean after the years following?
Yeah, right. So I'm 18 years old and I have not met graduation requirements.
Do they have to send that letter? I remember reading about there's a letter they have to send to the parents. I can't remember exactly what it was about though.
So parents will be notified, and they will be notified that the student is still eligible for public education services under the Individuals with Disabilities Act in the least restrictive environment. That's that LRE, right? So as you've been reading, you've been noticing that special education has a lot of acronyms, right? IDEA, 504 plan, LRE, which means least restrictive environment. So depending on the student's disability, the public school must provide an education for them in the least restrictive environment up until the age of 21. And typically, if the child or the individual, because they're an adult when they turn 18, when the individual turns 21, let's say they turn 21 in March, the school system is typically going to complete that program to the end of the year, right? Even if they're over the age of 21. But under the law, on their 21st birthday, the school division could say, you're finished. But that usually is not the way it works, because most of the individuals who will stay in the school division, in the school system, will be students with intellectual disabilities, okay? But if there is a student who has average IQ, they could stay in a trade program paid for by the public school system until they finish that training, okay? So those are the provisions under IDEA. So what's a 504 plan? Does anybody remember? .504 comes under the Rehabilitation Act. So it's a totally separate legal issue, okay? The 504 plan is typically instituted for students who do not need as much support as somebody who falls under the provisions of IDEA. So that might be somebody with a mild learning disability or a mild form of ADHD. And oftentimes parents will opt for a 504 because there are not as many rules and regulations and testing requirements, and they don't have to have a home visit. And it usually will only include, the 504 plan will only include the provisions that are really mostly accommodations, not modifications to the curriculum. Okay, and those are things like extended time on tests, testing in what's either called isolation, so for fewer distractions, a student might be in a cubicle to take their tests. It might be extended time on turning assignments in. It might be the use of dictation software for writing assignments or in class. Okay, so for example, my son, the accommodations he received, let's say starting in upper elementary school and middle school, were the typical extended time on tests. So he had time and a half. He had access to a scribe during class. So an adult would go in with him during class and they would write down the notes, right? So far we haven't modified the curriculum. He's still learning meeting the same goals and objectives as his typically developing peers. Okay. What else did he have? He had, so in elementary school, they decided, before they tried the dictation software, they set up a printer in every classroom for him so that when he typed, at first he was learning how to typed his notes, he could print his notes in the classroom and take just put the printed notes right in his notebook. So those of you who have been in a classroom, a child comes into your classroom, they have a printer there for them, they have a laptop provided by the school. Let's say middle school. Is that going to work?
No.
Why? Why?
Because all the kids in the class are going to be like, why does he have that printer? Why does he have that laptop? Why don't I have one?
Okay, sometimes the other students will question, but
you also have 5 different classes you have to go to every day.
And what happens? Think about what you have to do when you take a laptop into a class.
plug it up, charge it, connect to Wi-Fi.
Exactly. He would have to go into every classroom. He'd have to open his computer. He would have to connect to the Wi-Fi, right? If you have 50-minute classes, how long is that going to take? If you take a laptop into a class, you open it up and you're connecting to the Wi-Fi, what's your estimate of time?
Hopefully only like 5 minutes.
5 minutes, but 5 minutes is a long time, right? So the teacher's already started and you're trying to connect to the Wi-Fi to make sure that you're connected, and so the teacher's already started and you haven't started taking notes. So what's happened?
You've
You're
missed
already behind.
You're already behind, okay? So is that a reasonable accommodation? It is not. So these are things that practicing teachers have to keep in mind. It sounded like a great idea, right? The school bought printers for every classroom. He had his laptop, and it didn't work because really nobody thought through the timeline. How long was it going to take him to once he got into the classroom, to get to his seat, to open his laptop? So imagine if you're a child, what's happening in your head?
Panicking.
Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, I'm missing everything.
Yes, panic and anxiety ensues. And that's exactly what happened. So here's an accommodation where everybody had good intentions, but it just did not work because nobody really thought about the time implications related to that. So when you're in an IEP meeting, and you're all going to be in IEP meetings, whether you're in a general ed classroom or a special ed classroom, you will be on an IEP team. So it's really important to always keep in mind the student's schedule and the time constraints involved when you're making recommendations for accommodation. So that system did not work. And that's when, so when they decided this was not working, they went to the scribe. They said, okay, so we're going to have to hire a scribe to be in all of his classes with him, to take notes for him, right? And so that was actually the accommodation that worked the best at that time for him. Okay, so that's an example of an accommodation. So let's go to a modification. So a modification is changing the curriculum. So
Can I ask a question before we move on? Sorry. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So kind of on the flip side of, the teachers and the faculty and staff trying to give the student what they need, what if the student, kind of like what Erica was saying, what if the student feels like judged by their peers, and so they don't want to use their accommodation, but you as the teacher know that in order for them to be successful, they really need to use that accommodation? How do you handle encouraging them to do so, but helping them with the peer situation, or helping the peers understand? Or I know in middle school that gets very tricky.
It does get really tricky, and sometimes that's working with the parent, and the parent working with the student, and helping to guide that student to understand that this is going to help them in a learning environment, but it's a really tricky time, right? Middle school and high school is a really tricky situation. And sometimes I've heard parents say, we're really working to get them out of, so they no longer need an IEP, right? And if you have a student who is college bound, you want to make sure that that does not happen. If they're college bound, their IEP or their 504 plan, and if you're in special ed, you're going to take a class and it's on transitioning, IEP and transitioning. It's a 1 credit hour class, because transitioning is really key. And IDEA is pushing for all of these transition plans to be instituted, so that you have to think about transition plans from elementary school to middle school, from middle school to high school, and high school to either trade, work, or college, right? And what is that going to take? If you let an IEP run out in middle school or in the middle of high school, that child then is going to have to be retested until they can get those accommodations back, right? So that's never a good idea and sometimes it takes a lot of work because parents view it, many parents will view it as a deficit, right? Rather than sometimes students with dyslexia have they have average or above average intelligence, mostly above average. And they also, because they think differently, their problem solving skills tend to be a little bit more creative, and they tend to be one step ahead creatively, right? In creating these in solving problems in any kind of field, right? So there are more medical professionals with dyslexia than in every other profession, which is really interesting because a lot of it is thinking through a problem really quickly. And so trying to get parents to kind of move away from the deficit model and move into more of what are the benefits of being dyslexic, right? Or what are the benefits of being autistic on the autism spectrum, right? Bill Gates, right? If Bill Gates is autistic, there are many people, and we tend not to think about these highly intelligent individuals having these types of disabilities. So making sure that teachers keep in mind and trying to help that student. And it's not easy because it's hard. So my middle son, who had the scribe, he used the scribe, he had the scribe. I'm closing the door here. After he graduated, he shared that, it was kind of weird. He knew he needed it because he knew he wanted to go to college. And if he wanted to go to college, he had to take these high-level classes, and he knew he needed the help in the scribes. But once he never used a scribe in college. He didn't need the scribe. So and here's something that I think teachers can learn from higher ed. Why did he not need a scribe in college?
A lot more students use their computers in class.
Yes. They use computers, and many more faculty post PowerPoints and notes online, right? And it's much easier to get those notes. Lots of times in college classes, they'll have a student that's taking notes in the class, and then anybody who's in that class can go to a center and grab those notes, right? Because they're available to them. And a lot of college faculty will provide all of their notes to students. So exactly, Colleen, that they're much more, I think just because of the structure, it's just easier. He never used a scribe. Now he used testing and isolation, and he used, what else? Extended time on his tests. So when he would go into a cubicle in college, they would go into these cubicles, and there was a camera that would watch them take tests to ensure that they were not cheating. But they would have little cubicles, and they could and they had to schedule their tests so many days in advance to make sure that the center knew that they were coming in to take their tests. But I think at the college level, it was a little bit easier to maneuver with his dyslexia and his dystonia than it was in either the middle school level. Middle school was the most difficult because in middle school, most teachers tried to get him. They would say things like, if you just slow down, you can write. If you just take more time, you can do it, right? So when we give those messages to students with disabilities, how are they receiving those messages?
that they must be like doing something wrong because it's not working the way the teacher says it's supposed to.
Right, right. If we say to a student, if you would just work harder, if you would just slow down, that causes a lot of frustrations with students with disabilities because they're trying probably 50% harder than the typically developing student, right? And I think we're slowly beginning to understand students who have average or above average intelligence and providing these accommodations. And if we provide them, then it's really interesting to see how far they can go. But it's an uphill battle. So those are examples of accommodations, and the modifications are very different though, because that's modifying the curriculum. If you modify the curriculum, you have to be very careful because then the student is not learning the same as the other students. So think back on Sean's story. Those of you who have watched Sean's story, how did they modify the curriculum for Sean?
They allowed manipulatives and had people coming in working on very basic skills and life skills, more so in the first school that he was in, while the other students were going on to like higher level thinking questions.
Right, so in the first grade classroom, right, toward the end of the year, his peers were achieving way ahead of him, right? And they were solving higher level, more complex math problems, where what Sean was working on, counting, right? So he's still in the first grade classroom, but he's working on one-to-one correspondence, while his peers are working on addition and subtraction. So they modified the curriculum. He's still in the first grade classroom, but he's not working on the same curriculum any longer. He's working on a different curriculum. So that's a modification. And if that persists through high school, most likely those students on a modified curriculum are not going to get a general diploma. They're going to get a modified diploma or a certificate of attendance. Right? What do I mean by one-to-one correspondence?
That'd be like with a teacher aide where you're in the classroom, but you have someone that's helping you hands-on, one-on-one.
Good guess. Not quite. So one-to-one correspondence is a mathematical skill. So William and Erica, do you remember from math? And the rest of you will learn it this coming year. What is one-to-one correspondence in mathematics?
That numbers represent amounts. Do that.
Yeah.
So that like if you had 5 cars, that would be the number 5. And knowing that number corresponds with a set amount.
Well, that's cardinality. Close. But they're related. So one-to-one correspondence, if I have 5 cars, right? So, and a teacher asked me to count those cards, or those cars. If I have, so I can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm pointing to the object as I'm counting. So that means I have one-to-one correspondence. I understand when I point to an object, that's 1. I go to the next object, that's 2, right? If I look at them all at once, and I can say that's 5, we're getting closer to cardinality. That means I can look at something and see it's 5. I don't have to count one by one. So one-to-one correspondence means I can count things one by one. So a child has to have one-to-one correspondence before they can add and subtract. Okay? So those of you who have not had the math methods class, that might be new to you, but if you have had it, brush up on that skill, okay? Because it's really important that if you're teaching either younger children in special education or you're teaching in elementary school, that you understand the different components of how children learn, whether it's how they learn to read or how they learn mathematics, so that you can make the appropriate accommodations. So if we're going, who said using manipulatives? So if I want to make an accommodation for a student that every time they solve a math problem, they have manipulatives with them, I might understand that they're making a bridge from one-to-one correspondence to cardinality or to problem-solving addition and subtraction problems. Okay? So you can, when you're taking these classes, right, as you get into these classes and you're learning the different methods, it's really important to keep your notes, keep your books, and make sure that as you're going through the program, you start to connect all of these ideas together so that when you're in an IEP meeting or you're talking to a parent, you can talk about either their reading skills or their math skills based on the concepts and the understanding that you know about how we learn mathematics and how we learn how to read. Those are probably the two most important areas that they focus on in elementary and middle school, right? Is language, reading, writing, and mathematics. Okay, and that's how you're going to determine as a teacher, where do I make accommodations and where do I make modifications if they're appropriate. And I think somebody sent a question in, and their question was, can you make accommodations for everybody in the classroom? Yes, you can. And sometimes that comes under what's called RTI, response to intervention, response to intervention, RTI. I'm not a big believer in RTI because it has its problems, but with the in 2007, IDEA brought in this idea of response to intervention. So before we would label a child or provide an IEP, let's try this response to intervention, which has tiers, right? Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. And this should sound familiar to you, William.
Definitely.
Definitely. So can you give us an example of response to intervention? I keep saying that wrong. Response to intervention that you've seen?
There was a third grader that I didn't work with, but he was up for child studies, and they got his homeroom teacher to try some, I guess, like in-house things. So in the classroom things like maybe a single step directions or just general accommodations, nothing very specific or nothing labor intense. Just recorded data, took observations, and they brought that to the next meeting to say, did these things work or did they not work? Did he need more intense services, or was this enough to continue on and make him successful?
Correct. It sounds great. What is the risk in RTI?
Well, if any kid gets additional modifications, they're going to do better. So maybe it's artificially inflated.
It could be. What's the other risk? So I'm in school and everybody meets and they all decide this would be great. We're not going to do an IEP yet because we're going to try these interventions first, and we're all in agreement.
Well, if they don't work, then that student has gone even longer without being able to get the services they need to be able to be successful. So they're just kind of like pushing it off even longer.
It could be, but the intervention might be an appropriate accommodation, but nothing's in writing. What's the risk?
Taken away until they decide to put in an IEP.
Yep.
The teacher could just not do it, and they're not legally bound to doing it.
Correct. The teacher's not legally bound. And what about our mobile society?
If the kid moves, then there's no record.
Exactly. So, the little Johnny has responded really well to these interventions that have been informal. He's doing great. And then all of a sudden, mom gets transferred to Seattle. And he's moving to Seattle with no IEP. So what has to happen?
Everything starts over again, child study wise.
Everything starts over again. Yes. And that is why RTI has really not taken off very strongly because of that risk. Parents are hesitant. If there's something going on that is severe, they usually will push for an IEP, because if something happens where the family has to move, then they have to start all over again. You're in our society, kids move in and out of schools all the time, right? And rarely does a child stay in one school, for their entire, one school division for their 12, 13 years, right? It's more common that they're going to move. So you have to take that into consideration when you're trying these interventions and it's not a formal process. And parents need to understand that. I think sometimes when we pitch response to intervention to parents, we often don't tell them, the risk involved. That if you move, then legally the receiving school division does not have to implement what is under the response to intervention. It's better to have it in writing, either in a 504 plan or in an IEP, a full IEP, if the child qualifies for services. Okay, so I do want you to understand the difference between accommodations and modifications, that the modifications change the curriculum, it changes what the child is learning. It's a modification to the objectives. Accommodations are to give the child a level playing field. Okay? So that it just kind of brings them up to where their peers are. So if you think about it, and many of you may have seen this, it's a pretty common photo. They have 3 children watching a baseball game and they're all different heights. And if the child who's the shortest can't see over the fence, but if you give them something to stand on, they can now see the baseball game, right? And that step, right, that allows them to see over the fence is the accommodation. It gives them the same level as the other children who are taller, if you think of it that way. It doesn't change anything, it just gives them a chance to perform based on their disability. The difficult part is that one child who, let's say, is dyslexic might not look anything like another child who is dyslexic. It's kind of like autism, right? It's a continuum. So you really have to kind of look on an individual basis and do a lot of assessments to kind of figure out what's going on. Other questions you might have?
So I have a question. If you have a student that is in high school and they have an IEP and you're on the team for that, do you want to leave as many accommodations as possible on their IEP? Like, say something hasn't really seemed to benefit them, would you take it off, or would you leave it on so that you have that as an option in college? Like if they could take, had an extra textbook, or they had the option of having like tests read to them or something like that, and you don't see that it's helping them, would you take it off or would you leave it on?
Well, it depends if it's not helping them or if they're not using it, right? You will get many high schoolers who will not use their accommodations for various reasons. and it might not be in their best interest, right? And sometimes you cannot force a student to use an accommodation. You can only encourage them. Now, their parents might try to force them to use it, but teenagers, they can be pretty resistant. If it's really not helping them, it might be, I'm trying to think, you have to be really careful, because I'm thinking about when my son started to use Dragon software, which is voice to text, and it was really hard. You had to train the software to your voice, and he didn't like it and he wasn't using it. But we kept it on the IEP, knowing that the technology was going to catch up, right? That it was a new technology, and the speed at the way things progress technology-wise, that we knew that someday, pretty soon, he would be able to talk into a device and it would just type, kind of like our phones, right? So we kept it on there knowing the technology was going to catch up, and it did, and it was beneficial. So because once you take it off, you have to reconvene the IEP team to get it back on. So I would always err on the side of caution. If it was put in there for some reason, keep it there. The student doesn't have to use it in college, but it's there if they need it, like books on tape or a scribe. Like my son, the scribe was on there, but he never had to use it. But if he needed it, if he got into a situation where he really needed a scribe, legally, then the school would have to get him a scribe. So I would leave it in there. Because somebody made the recommendation somewhere along the line.
Mm-hmm.
And so when a child is about 13 or 14, you're going to start teaching them to advocate for themselves, because by the time they get into college, they need to be able to go to people and tell them what works and what doesn't work. And they have to be confident enough to advocate for themselves. And it's really important for children. The earlier they can advocate for themselves, the better. And that takes a lot of confidence, because people in higher ed are not really educated enough to know that students with high intelligence that might have a specific learning disability can achieve great things. They tend to have lower expectations for them. I've heard many faculty institute policies that are discriminatory towards students with disabilities. I've known faculty who tell students they're not allowed to use laptops in their classroom. If they have a disability, they can bring a laptop and sit in the back of the room, right? That should never happen. One, you're disclosing a student's disability, and two, you have low expectations, okay? So always keep as many accommodations as you can squeeze in there. Other questions?
Could I ask a question about the deeper learning video?
Mm-hmm.
I was just kind of curious, do you think that's more of the direction that our education system is going, or is that just kind of a unique way of learning?
I would hope that someday we get that far. It really depends on where you are geographically, right? So this region is very traditional. Paper, pencil, worksheets, memorization. We haven't gotten very far from that paradigm. But if you, unfortunately, except if you fall under the gifted category, right? There are some really good gifted programs in this area. They're pretty limiting as to who gets into the gifted programs. In elementary and middle school, I never allowed my children to get involved in gifted ed programs for various reasons. I don't think they're healthy for young children. In high school, it's a little different. Students begin to separate themselves, right, as to their career goals and their career paths. But if we could follow a gifted curriculum for every child, it's kind of more like what you were experiencing with the differentiation and those types of programs. If you go to the West Coast, Seattle, Colorado, Oregon, they take bigger risks in their education programs, so you'll see more of a flexibility in the curriculums in those areas. I've done a lot of work in Colorado and worked with some people and they do tend to have more of a problem-based learning and differentiated instruction and more open discourse than I would say probably some more of the conservative regions. So it varies from region to region, and then it can also vary from school to school, right? So Darrington Elementary in Lynchburg has a really creative curriculum. It's pretty open. They do a lot of science, they do a lot of math, they do a lot of hands-on, they do a lot of problem-based learning. Trying to think of some other schools that are a little bit more problem-based. Bedford County is doing some creative things with curriculums and giving students more choice. So it varies, and that's kind of why when I talk to students when they're interviewing, when you go out to interview for a job, you're interviewing the school as much as they're interviewing you, because you have to find a good fit. And you can find creative classrooms and creative schools. You just have to kind of hunt for them. Hopefully someday we'll get there. I don't think we're there yet quite. And I think the standardized testing movement really hurt a lot of creative curriculums. But good question. Unfortunately, I don't have a very rosy picture. A lot of private schools, independent schools, tend to be a little bit more creative. New Vista Schools, which is a school for students with learning differences, they have a pretty creative curriculum. Other questions? Everything working okay now on Moodle? Okay, if we don't have any more questions, I'll sign off. I see tired faces. Some people have been asking me about the exam. I haven't written the exam yet, but I will post it. I'm supposed to give the exam. I'm supposed to not open the exam until exam period starts. I think it's July 1st and 2nd. I might post it a little early because I know some people have been working right along and are clipping along with their assignments. So I'll try to post it a little bit earlier for those of you who are ready to take it earlier. Okay? All right, well, if I have no more questions, I'll sign off for the evening, and you can always email me questions as they come up. All right, good night.
Good night.